In my first hour with Salt and Sanctuary, I must have said, yeah, that's just like Dark Souls, a few dozen times. There's really no getting around it either. Salt and Sanctuary is heavily inspired by the Soul series, and it's so much so that I think the similarities could be off-putting to some people. The game does add a few unique flourishes in an attempt to stand out, but I don't think it's nearly enough to allow the game to stand on its own. In the end, it's an incredibly solid 2D translation of Souls-inspired mechanics, but it can also feel a bit too close to its source material. Things get started at the character creator. Here you can choose your gender, hairstyles, nationality, a starting class, a starting item, and even enable some challenge run options. Now, I haven't tried the challenge options just yet, but it is really cool to see a hardcore mode in there for people crazy enough to try it. Now, much like last year when Axiom Verge had a built-in speedrun mode, I'm really appreciative when developers include an option for challenge runs like that. The character creator itself has a decent amount of options and classes that, much like in Souls, don't necessarily lock you into a specific character build throughout the game. It's actually really easy to start as a mage, and then build towards something totally different as you progress. After a brief intro sequence, complete with an optional boss that'll likely one-shot you, your character washes up on the shore of a mysterious island. From this point on, it's up to you to explore, talk to NPCs, and read item descriptions to piece together the lore of the land. Salt and Sanctuary's world is split up into numerous areas that are all woven together with different pathways and shortcuts to unlock. There's often multiple areas to explore, and as you'll find later in the game, many reasons to come back to early parts of the game. The world feels huge, and there's a decent amount of variety in the environments throughout. I just wish the game didn't rely mostly on overly dark areas. It would be nice to have a bit more diverse lighting in that respect. I also think something is lost in the transition from 3D to 2D. There's something about standing at the top of a tower, looking out into the distance, and seeing a castle that you've been to before that just feels really great. Seeing recognizable locations in the distance adds a certain amount of depth and believability to the world. Now, I don't want to spend this entire review comparing, but that feeling is lost in Salt and Sanctuary, and the lack of a map can make it pretty easy to get lost. Ultimately, the world in Salt and Sanctuary just isn't very cohesive. There's a lot there, and some parts look really great, but I just didn't find it very memorable even after multiple playthroughs. From the beginning, there's a pretty vague mission to follow that essentially leads to you tracking down around 20 different bosses and taking them on. On the way, you'll fight enemies that drop salt, which can be used at sanctuaries to level your character. Now, you'll of course have to be careful, as dying will result in the temporary loss of your salt. In order to recover your lost salt, you'll need to take on an enemy that killed you, or a ghost-like bat creature if your death was environmental. You'll also join a creed, of which there are many, and use them to claim sanctuaries that you find in the world. In these sanctuaries, you'll level up and invite fellow followers of your creed. These followers can be blacksmiths, mages, travelers, or even shopkeepers. As long as you share the same creed, their service will be open to you. Now, while in some cases an opposing creed could lock you out of some options at specific sanctuaries, you're never going to be locked out of leveling your character. Now, this is done through the Tree of Skill, which offers a specific starting point for each class and a large skill tree that's literally shaped like a tree. Now, the Tree of Skill can be a little daunting at first, but with time it starts to become pretty easy to understand. You're just going to simply build in the direction that makes most sense for your character. The combat in Salt and Sanctuary feels pretty great, and once again is a pretty good representation of the game it draws so much inspiration from. The class and weapon variety lends itself really well to multiple playthroughs. Parrying feels super great, taking advantage of roll invincibility frames is imperative, and taking the time to learn enemy attack patterns absolutely pays off. Salt and Sanctuary can be challenging, though my experience with the Souls series likely helped in making the game a little easier overall. At this point, I'm comfortable with this type of game, and due to that, I found myself taking down the majority of bosses without much trouble. Now, that didn't stop me from feeling amped up every time I took down another boss, though. Salt and Sanctuary absolutely nails that triumphant feeling that you get from overcoming a difficult challenge. Now, at this point, it should be pretty obvious what inspired Salt and Sanctuary. But there is another system at work here that was actually a pretty pleasant surprise for me. Specifically, there are brands that you'll acquire throughout the game that will give you the ability to access areas that were previously unavailable. It's a little pinch of Castlevania mixed in that helps add another layer to Salt and Sanctuary. I only wish these abilities were used a bit more often, as they'd be a great way for changing up the level design a little later in the game. There are times where Salt and Sanctuary tries to mix things up, and it does add some slight changes to some familiar mechanics. At the same time, I don't think it does enough to give itself a unique identity. As a huge From Software fan, I'm happy to see the Souls genre expand with entries from smaller developers. In this case, Ska Studios clearly loves the Souls games, and they've done a fantastic job of making that kind of game. Unfortunately, I think the sheer amount of similarities might turn people off. Even late into the game, the number of references kept piling up, and even caused me to roll my eyes a little bit. That said, I'm really enjoying my time playing Salt and Sanctuary, and that should be evident with the fact that I've created 4 characters, I've finished the game with 1, and I'm at the very end with a 2nd. I just think this game could be so much more had it made more of an effort to stand out. Now that's not going to stop me from coming back to this one. At the end of the day, Salt and Sanctuary is a successful take on From Software's Soul series, something that I can't really get enough of, and it's actually really nice to see a different developer's take on this style of game.